Welcome to Poetry for the Soul, Part 8. Today we begin with a long quote from the great poet Rainer Maria Rilke. Ah, but poems amount to so little when you write them too early in your life. You ought to wait and gather sense and sweetness for a whole lifetime, and a long one if possible. And then at the very end, you might perhaps be able to write 10 good lines. For poems are not, as people think, simply emotions. Parentheses. One has emotions early enough. End parentheses. They are experiences. For the sake of a single poem, you must see many cities, many people and things. You must understand animals, must feel how birds fly, and know the gesture which small flowers make when they open in the morning. You must be able to think back to streets in unknown neighborhoods, to unexpected encounters, and to partings you had long seen coming, to days of childhood whose mystery is still unexplained, to parents whom you had to hurt when they brought in a joy and you didn't pick it up. Parentheses. It was a joy meant for somebody else. End parentheses. To childhood illnesses that began so strangely, with so many profound and difficult transformations. To days in quiet, restrained rooms, and to mornings by the sea, to the sea itself, to seas, to nights of travel that rushed along high overhead and went flying with all the stars. And it is still not enough to be able to think of all that. You must have memories of many nights of love, each one different from all the others. Memories of women screaming in labor, and of light, pale, sleeping girls who have just given birth and are closing again. But you must also have been beside the dying, must have sat beside the dead in the room with the open window and the scattered noises. And it is not yet enough to have memories. You must be able to forget them when they are many. And you must have the immense patience to wait until they return. For the memories themselves are not important. Only when they have changed into our very blood, into glance and gesture, and are nameless, no longer to be distinguished from ourselves, only then can it happen that in some very rare hour the first word of a poem arises in the midst and goes forth from them. David McCord writes, "Poetry, like rain, should fall with elemental music. Poetry for children should keep reminding them that the English language is a most marvelous and availing instrument. Poetry is probably the only form of reading one can most appreciate without fully understanding the words. Poetry works on rhythm and sound as much as on word knowledge, making it safe for struggling readers. Joanne Durham, teacher. A good poem contains both meaning and music. Eve Merriam. Poetry is the language in which man explores his own amazement. A poem should not mean, but be. Archibald MacLeish. Poetry is the kind of thing you have to see from the corner of your eye. For a poem is not the end, but the beginning of an excursion. Back and forth we go, scenes, impressions, ideas. All sorts of quick glimpses are quickly dismissed as random or uninteresting, but some lead richly onward. William Stafford. A poem is like a radio that can broadcast continually for thousands of years. Allen Ginsberg. Bringing children and poetry together can be one of the most exciting experiences in parenting or teaching. Over the years, however, I have noted in too many cases what I have coined the dam approach, dissecting, analyzing, and meaninglessly memorizing poetry to death. Lee Bennett Hopkins. Poetry is a different area of the brain, parentheses, from fiction, much closer to music and mathematics. Margaret Atwood. Lesha on Poetry from Dancing on the Edge by Han Nolan. I read my poems, page after page of beautiful words and thoughts and truths, the truest, realest things I know. I decided that night, reading poetry beneath a caged light bulb, that real was when you could feel your whole body light up from within, when it didn't matter about day or night, dark or light, because you could carry the light with you in the dancing, in the music, in the poetry. He lives the poetry that he cannot write. The others write the poetry that they dare not realize. Oscar Wilde. It is the timber of poetry that wears most surely. And there is no timber that has not strong roots among the clay and worms. John Synge. Poetry is when an emotion has found its thought and the thought has found words. Robert Frost. Poetry is the music of the soul, and above all, of great and feeling souls. Voltaire. All good poetry is forged slowly and patiently, link by link, with sweat and blood and tears. Alfred Douglas. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Poetry fetters the human race. Nations are destroyed or flourish in proportion as their poetry, painting, and music are destroyed or flourish. William Blake. The production of all arts are kinds of poetry, and their craftsmen are all poets. Plato. Painting is poetry that is seen rather than felt, and poetry is painting that is felt rather than seen. Leonardo da Vinci. Poetry is the art of creating imaginary gardens with real toads. Marianne Moore. Poetry is an echo asking a shadow to dance. Carl Sandburg. Poetry is the deification of reality. Dame Edith Sitwell. Poetry surrounds us everywhere, but putting it on paper is, alas, not so easy as looking at it. Vincent van Gogh. Ye stars, which are the poetry of heaven. Lord Byron. Listen, real poetry doesn't say anything. It just ticks off the possibilities, opens all doors. You can walk through any one that suits you. Jim Morrison. Poetry may make us from time to time a little more aware of the deeper, unnamed feelings which form the substratum of our being, to which we rarely penetrate, for our lives are mostly a constant evasion of ourselves. T.S. Eliot. Poetry is nearer to vital truth than history. Plato. Most people read poetry listening for echoes, because the echoes are familiar to them. They wade through it the way a boy wades through water, feeling with his toes for the bottom. The echoes are the bottom. Wallace Stevens. I'm a failed poet. Maybe every novelist wants to write poetry first, finds he can't, and then tries the short story, which is the most demanding form after poetry. And failing at that, only then does he take up novel writing. William Faulkner. If my poetry aims to achieve anything, it is to deliver people from the limited ways in which they see and feel. Jim Morrison. The fear of poetry is an indication that we are cut off from our own reality. Muriel Rukeyser. Even when poetry has a meaning, as it usually has, it may be inadvisable to draw it out. Perfect understanding will sometimes almost extinguish pleasure. A. E. Housman.